Mike Roselle, and I'm with Climate Ground Zero.
And what is Climate Ground Zero?
Well, we're a grassroots action network, and right now we're based in West Virginia. And what we're doing is to mobilize and organize mass civil disobedience against the mountaintop removal in West Virginia, the mining for coal.
Yeah. Oh wow. Okay. And do you think that's the biggest environmental crisis facing humanity today?
Well, if you look at the climate crisis, and you have to look at carbon, and if you look at carbon, most of it comes from coal. And so if you want to solve the climate problem, you have to solve the coal problem. And right now it would be the easiest one to deal with, except for the coal industry has a tremendous amount of political power. But if you're going to cap carbon emissions, the easiest way to get a reduction is to eliminate the 50% of the electricity that we use made from coal. Now, if you look at coal, the worst coal mining that we have, not just in the U.S., but in the world, is mountaintop removal coal, where they blow off the top of mountains. These are forested mountains with streams, and they mine a thin seam of coal and they dump it into valleys and cover up the creeks and rivers. So we can't really pretend that we're addressing the climate crisis while we're blowing off the tops of mountains for coal. And everyone has talked about this and everyone is outraged about it, but in West Virginia they don't care what other people think. And they don't have any law in West Virginia because of the Fourth Circuit's recent decision says that all decisions on surface mining will be made by the state of West Virginia and not by the federal government. We're exempt from all federal laws. So again, if we're going to address the climate crisis, we have to address the problem we have in West Virginia. And it's not just West Virginia, but it's places like West Virginia. It's, Arizona where they're mining coal. It's in Alberta where they're mining tar sands. These places are being invaded and they're exempt from the law. And this is where most of this carbon is ultimately produced.
Do you think it's sort of hypocritical for us or for the governments to be talking about reducing carbon emissions and talking about everyone selling their cars and buying Priuses when we're doing things like cutting off the tops of mountains?
Yeah, it's absolutely insane that we pretend that we have a plan to deal with the climate crisis, and yet we don't have a plan to shut down the tar sands, to shut down mountaintop removal mining, the strip mining that's going on in Wyoming, and the strip mining that's going on in Arizona. This is where all this stuff comes from, and it goes right into the air. So if you don't have a campaign to shut these things down, shutting down the coal-fired power plants is great, but someone else will buy that coal. You have to stop it where they get it. And there's really not much work, there's not much money, there's not much effort actually going into these regions where these groups are fighting this stuff. They're fighting it from Washington, D.C. and San Francisco and New York City. And we've got to bring the fight directly to the affected areas.
How do you think the best way to fight it is?
Well, we don't have much to fight them with. They're very big, they're very powerful, and they own the courts and the politicians. The only thing that we have is our bodies, our willingness to stand up to them.
So that's where direct action comes into place?
That is what I think the people who are trying to end segregation in the South during the civil rights period came to the very same conclusion. That ultimately it was going to take sacrifice, it's going to take courage, but the most important thing is just to stand up to them and see what happens. But in many of these regions, that they've stood up before, and they have a long history of struggling against the coal industry or the oil industry or whatever, and they're very, very powerful. And so the only way really you can prevail is to have more willpower than they do.
What's the most important thing for individuals that are concerned to be doing?
Well, I mean, there are many fronts on which we need to fight, and we need to show up on all of those and do the best we can. So whether it's working with through the normal systems, trying to get your political leaders to pay attention and pass laws, enforce laws that are on there, whether it's being part of an environmental organization or some other organization that is trying to put pressure on these decision makers, or whether it's just intervening yourself in any way that you can. Uh, and conservation and all those things are important. But I think if we really want to seriously end the mining and burning of coal, we're going to have to take this fight right to the mines. And I think that people should demand that they be shut down. I think Dr. Hansen was correct when he said these are death factories. These power plants are death factories. The trains are death trains. And the coal fields are killing fields.
It seems like the obstacles we're facing are monumental. I mean, it seems like we've got to turn around so much of what it is to be human and to have corporate society and to have all these big governments that are working with it. How do we turn something around that's so profitable as such a small group?
Well, I mean, we're not a small group, first of all. We're not always organized, but the environmental movement is the largest movement that's ever existed in the history of human civilization. And we're in every country, and it goes from college professors to people who live in villages and workers. And so it really is going to be up to our movement to lead this change. But we have to bring everybody with us, and that will be the difficult thing. But I think that we're facing a crisis. It's becoming more and more evident that we may have already even reached a tipping point, that we're going to see a mass extinction, that we're going to see the loss of the glaciers no matter what. It's just a matter of how fast this is all going to happen. And if people really take that to heart, I think, and act in a unified manner, I think we can mitigate a lot of the worst effects of climate change and make it through it, as a species. But they have to understand that that's really where we are. We're on the very brink. The tipping point that Dr. Hansen's been talking about, this is a very key thing, and we don't have a lot of time. And that's why all these people who want to wait for Obama to get around to ending coal mining in Appalachia, we don't have time. We have to act now.
How do we get everybody else involved? I mean, if it is the biggest movement, how do we get the critical mass necessary to actually force the change into action?
Well, if we knew the answer to that question, then we would have solved this problem a long time ago. The only thing I know is that you have to lead by example. And if you really want people to challenge the powers that be, then you have to challenge the powers that be. And I think that, public opinion is on our side. I think we just got to, the time for education, I think, has ended, and the time to motivate people to really take this seriously is where we are now. And that's why a campaign of mass civil disobedience, which Dr. Hansen has called for, and Bill McKibben has called for, but also that Al Gore has called for. And if they want this to happen, then they're going to have to step in and put their own bodies on the line too, because nonviolence is something that one doesn't preach. And but I think that a growing number of people are aware of this, and that we're likely to see massive disobedience to shut down the coal industry, and probably some very large demonstrations this summer. And hopefully some of those will be in West Virginia, where we are, and where a lot of the folks that were here now have pledged to come down and stand with us.
Do you think, how long do you think it'll be, optimistically, till we shut down coal?
I think we can shut down mountaintop removal in the next year.
Yeah.
But we're not going to be able to wait for a bill to get passed and then enforced. We're not going to be able to wait for the legal courts to decide on the merits of the various lawsuits that we have. We're going to do it through just mounting public pressure.
Could we repeat that question again? We're getting either interference or battery problems.
What is it?
I'm getting static. Let's try that from there.
No problem.
How long do you think it'll take before we actually have like a tangible success in this goal?
Well, I think we can end mountaintop removal in the next year if we can build the public pressure that's necessary. I don't think we can wait for the courts to decide. I don't think we can wait for the Obama administration to act. I think that people are just going to have to demand it. And I think that we're going to have to really have a showdown in West Virginia if we're going to beat the coal industry, if we're going to beat the largest coal producer in the world, if we're going to stop coal production in one of the largest coal deposits in the world, we're going to have to shut down Massey Energy. And that's our goal. And if we can get rid of Massey, then I think we can start hammering away at all the other companies. But if we can't get rid of Massey, if we're still stuck with a lawless situation this time next year in West Virginia, then I don't think there's going to be a lot of hope.
And if we are stuck with the same situation in West Virginia, what does not a lot of hope look like?
Well, the loss of the Appalachian Mountains will mean a lot more than just destruction of the homes and communities and forests, that are there. This is where the water for most of the people in the East Coast comes from, the water that they drink, the water that they use for agriculture, the water they use for transportation. All these rivers originate in the Appalachians. If these mountaintops are paved over, and that's what they look like after a mountaintop removal. They don't have pavement on it, but they're basically a paved surface. And that water comes down there all at once in these extreme weather events. It's going to totally change the river system. And there'll be a lot of water in there the day after a big storm, and there won't be any in the summer. And this is going to create a crisis. So this affects everyone in the U.S. Also, all these sludge impoundments that are part of this process, those are going to eventually fail and get into this water supply. And it's going to contaminate it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to the Chesapeake Bay, all the way to New York. It's just a catastrophe if this is allowed to happen. And it won't be just what's happening in the Appalachians. It's because the same kind of thing is happening in so many other places too. And the people in Appalachia realize that they're not fighting just for their own homeland, but that all of the homelands are under attack. And if we can beat them there, then we can beat them in these other places too. But we've got to turn them around somewhere. And with all this talk and all these conventions and all these organizations now working on climate, all the indicators are still going in the wrong direction. Yeah. And we can't pretend that we have a response. We can't pretend that we have a campaign when all the indicators show that things continue to get worse. So if this is not a time for mass civil disobedience, if this is not a time to stand up to the coal companies, then I'm afraid we're never going to do it.
Yeah, it's almost like we've reached the critical point where an inconvenient truths come out. People have been working on this for 20, 30 years, but our amount of carbon in the atmosphere and the amount of destruction keeps going up. Like, what does that mean?
Well, we have to save ourselves. That's where we are today. I mean, we actually are the generation of humans that has the fate of our species in our hands. And if we don't act correctly at this moment, then we don't have a future. And the planet has a future. Speciation will continue. With humans gone, the clock gets turned back to zero. Nature has time. This is about saving ourselves, and we're really on the brink of our own extinction. So if that doesn't motivate people, then maybe it's better that we leave the stage. But I have hope that human beings can get together and solve this problem. And if they do, we'll be better as a species. And even with all the adverse effects of climate change, at least we'll have banded together, at least we'll have figured out how to reduce our impact and maybe survive for, who knows, long enough to see the really adverse effects that we've had on this planet start to reverse themselves.
Are you optimistic that we can reach sustainability on this planet without billions of people dying?
I know that we can do it if we put our minds to it, but it's kind of unprecedented for humans to work together across the kind of spectrum that we have to do now. So this would be very unprecedented. But there are some examples in history where people have gotten together and solved big problems. And I hate to go back and think about them. They were like Mongol invasions and plagues and all of these sort of things. And we've survived those things. And so, and in surviving, we're stronger. So I'm optimistic because it's still possible. But I'm a little bit terrified because we have so little time. And most of our strategies are based on long-range objectives. And right now we need to achieve some very critical short-term objectives. And one of those objectives is to end mountaintop removal. But part of that also is to completely eliminate the use of coal.
Well, what is it? What does this civil disobedience look like? You mentioned, do people have to get arrested? Am I going to have to get arrested? What does it look like?
Well, civil disobedience means a lot of things. And what happened here yesterday, we were civilly disobedient. Now, we weren't arrested. It was a direct action. And I think it was an excellent one. I think it really brought people together. It showed them that they had power, and that if we can knock this one off of the grid, then we can start knocking some of the other bad ones off the grid. But in a sense, when you talk about nonviolence, you're talking about more than civil disobedience. And when you go up against the powers that be, such as Massey, the West Virginia state government, and all their allies, civil disobedience means to challenge them and to make them respond. And it's going to be a lot more than just marching up and down the street and getting arrested and sitting in a bus. We have a long tradition here in D.C. of doing these kind of protests. And I think we have to ask ourselves, we marched against the war. We didn't stop it. And if we think that we're going to march against coal and stop it, it's not going to work. We're going to have to escalate. And we're going to have to take the battle to the coal fields. And when Martin Luther King came here for his I Have a Dream speech, no one got arrested. They went back to Mississippi to get arrested. They went back to Alabama to get arrested. And they took the fight to the heart of the Deep South. And that's where they won. And when they won that, it lifted the boats for everywhere. And slowly, segregation, which at that time, there was segregation in Oregon. There was segregation in Indiana. It wasn't just the South. But when they ended it in the South, they ended it everywhere. And so we're convinced that we have to bring this battle to the coal fields, and we have to win it there.
Now, coal's a big issue. Can you tell me about what's happening with the tar sands?
Well, I know that a lot of groups are addressing this issue. I know there's a lot of pressure being put on the Canadian government. I know our own government has been putting some pressure on them recently. But it really is the big elephant in the room, isn't it? Not much is being done about it. A lot is being said about it. And I think the same will be true for the tar sands. These are rural areas. They're very sparsely populated, and people are overpowered by the size and the money that the energy companies have. So it's not surprising that they don't have any political power to oppose that there. So it's going to take pressure from the places that are using the energy. And we need to outlaw the sale and transport of dirty energy. And the dirtiest energy is tar sands. It's one of the few things that can actually beat coal in that respect. And the states who buy it are breaking a law. It's an immoral criminal activity. So we have to shut down the market in dirty industry. And they have supply lines that go from Alberta to all over the world now. They have the same supply lines go from Appalachia to New York City or from Wyoming to Los Angeles. We've got to shut down these death trains.
Wow. What law is it actually breaking?
Well, if you look at the environmental laws of this country, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, this energy production is in violation of all three of those laws. Those laws are just not applied. We have ample laws on our books. We just do not have any agencies that have the courage to enforce them. And that's why part of civil disobedience is to try to address this question, not to enforce the law ourselves so much as to demonstrate that there is no law. And And this is the situation. You know, the state of California cannot talk about being clean and going into renewables when they're addicted to tar sands coal, when they're addicted to natural gas from Alberta, when they're addicted to Wyoming coal. And this is the dirty little secret. So I think that we need to put a lot more light on this issue. And the best way to do it is to interrupt that flow. It is an illegal industry. And this is how we address the old growth timber trade. We hit the supply lines. We shut it down. We seized ships. We blocked logging. We went after the distributors. We went after the retailers. We went after the consumers. We went through the entire supply chain, and we hit every sector of it that we could as often as we could until we shut it down. And this is exactly what we have to do with coal. We have to focus on the supply chain. And it starts with the dig, and it ends with the burn. And then from there on, it's clean electrons that everybody enjoys. So it's this dirty part of the supply chain that really needs to get our focus. And it's also the weakest part of the system because they can't protect all of it with people who are not afraid to get arrested, who are not afraid to sit in the road. And it's time for those folks to realize that this is our last opportunity. If they want to see a new world, if they want to see a new type of government, a new type of economy, then this is the time to stand up for it.
Wow. Do we have other examples from the past where this kind of thing's worked?
Well, I like to look at the civil rights movement because this really was the most dynamic campaign of the powerless against the powerful. And I think the civil rights movement has pretty much written the book on how these things are done. And if one looks at the works of Martin Luther King, you see brilliant strategist, not just a moral leader, but someone who knew how to keep the political pressure up and who could work with really disenfranchised people, poor people, illiterate people, and help build them into a mass movement that, literally changed the government and the laws of this country. So it's going to take that kind of commitment, that kind of courage. And if we can, that's the part of the civil rights movement that we have to match, not their strategy, not their ideology, but their courage and their commitment and their willingness to sacrifice for their goals.
Do you have anything planned over the next, year or 18 months where you think you're going to have a result?
We're going to try to have an action a week until we end mountaintop removal. We got one coming next week, and we don't know. We'll queue up another one for the week after, just like we did at the Nevada test site when we ended underground nuclear testing. We had an encampment, and we trained people, we prepared them, and then we helped them get to the test site. And if they wanted to cross the gate at the front line, that's where they got arrested. We got as many as 8,000 people arrested there in one day. Eventually, or else we take them into the backcountry. And 3 times we delayed nuclear testing, and that's the only 3 times that that's ever happened. So eventually hundreds of people were arrested in the backcountry. So I see this campaign as shaping up a little bit like the test site campaign, and we have a lot of the veterans of the test site campaign now working with us, and they'll be coming out this summer to set up our it'll be a peace camp, but it'll really be a coal camp.
Yeah. Well, we're making a film, like I was telling you, about revolutions. It's all about how humans are going to survive the next 100 years, showing that the revolution started, people are hitting the streets, they are taking direct action, and this is what's working, and this is how it's working. So we're trying to find groups of people and conservation groups or individuals that are going through this process, trying to achieve a result, and then we're going to jump on board with them for the movie and follow them to this success or this failure and through their ups and downs. And
The last movie.
yeah. So if you've got anything
Yeah, no, we'll keep you in the loop. Just check out on Climate Ground Zero because we announce everything before we do it there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think if you look, since the WTO, people have seen civil disobedience and nonviolence as marching through the streets and maybe locking down and having a confrontation with the police. And that, to me, is not really enough. And if we need to take it to the next level, to true nonviolence.
Yeah.
And for all these groups to pretend that they're practicing nonviolence when they're doing something that's very safe and very predictable, something that was a good strategy in the 90s, because then our goal was just to get attention. We really were in the phase of trying to educate the public. But to expect that these tactics that we used in the 90s are going to work now when they haven't worked for a while and when so much more is needed, I think it's irresponsible. And we are going to have to ramp up our nonviolence to match our rhetoric. And that's what we're going to try to do in the coalfields.
So what can someone like me do?
Well, what you're doing now, I think, is very helpful. I mean, motivating people now. I think everyone understands there's a climate problem. I think they understand that it has to do with our carbon footprint. And I think they understand even more generally that it has to do with growth. And, but to be part of this movement and to help it achieve its goals, that's what people need to do. And everybody's got to do that in their own way. And not everybody can hike up into the mountaintop removal areas and sit on the explosives. Not everybody can cross the line at the front gate, but everybody can do something. And that's what we want. We want them to do whatever they can.